The city of Manhattan shimmered beneath a silk of amber lights, its towering skyline glowing like a crown against the velvet dusk. On the 37th floor of an elite rooftop lounge, jazz murmured through the air like a lover's whisper, soft, smooth, and slightly intoxicated. Ethan Callahan sat alone by the bar, nursing a glass of Dalmore 25, with the absent-minded swirl of a man lost in 1,000 thoughts. His tailored navy suit clung to his tall, broad-shouldered frame with effortless elegance, the loosened tie and rolled sleeves revealing just enough of the man beneath the empire. CEO of Callahan Industries. Billionaire. Ruthless dealmaker. His name alone opened doors most people didn't even know existed. But tonight, the man behind the legend looked tired. The kind of tired that no amount of wealth or whiskey could fix. He leaned back, staring past the glimmering cityscape, his mind heavy with numbers, negotiations, and the kind of isolation that success often brings. Plenty of people were in the room: models, investors, influencers, women in sequined dresses, flashing practiced smiles. But none pierced the steel walls he'd spent years constructing. Until she walked in. Amara Brooks didn't belong in a place like this. And that's exactly why Ethan noticed her. She stepped through the heavy glass doors with hesitant grace, her soft curls swept into a low chignon, a black satin dress hugging her figure with quiet sophistication. No designer logos, no diamonds, no loud laughter to draw attention. Yet the moment she entered, something shifted in the atmosphere, subtle but undeniable. Ethan's glass paused mid-air. Her skin glowed with the richness of deep brown velvet, her features delicate but composed, and her eyes. God, her eyes. They were wide, almond-shaped, and framed with thick lashes. But it wasn't their shape that caught him. It was the sadness tucked carefully behind them, as if she carried too many unspoken stories in her gaze. She glanced around and walked toward the far end of the bar, settling into a seat with grace from being taught to take up as little space as possible. She ordered something soft, a citrus cocktail, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers trembling slightly. Ethan watched her, drawn by something he couldn't name. She didn't look like someone chasing luxury or status. She didn't check her phone every few seconds. She wasn't posing, wasn't performing. She was existing. Quiet, beautiful, unreachable. He found himself rising before he even realized he'd made the decision. Ethan closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished bar counter. "You don't seem like the kind of woman who drinks alone," he said, voice low, threaded with a silky confidence that had closed more deals than he could count. She turned, startled, and for a second, just a second, he saw the wall go up behind her eyes. Then she offered a smile, gentle but guarded. "And you don't seem like the kind of man who talks to strangers." Ethan tilted his head, amused. "Maybe tonight's full of surprises." Amara looked away momentarily, her fingers brushing the rim of her glass. "Maybe," she echoed, her voice like velvet dipped in vulnerability. There was something so achingly real about her that Ethan couldn't look away. Not the way he usually couldn't look away, because of desire or conquest, but because he wanted to understand the story that lived in the way her shoulders subtly slumped, the hesitation before each sentence, the way she avoided eye contact a beat too long. They spoke for what felt like hours, not about money, business, or the false glitter of this world, but about books she loved as a child, the smell of her grandmother's kitchen, the way the rain in Harlem felt heavier than anywhere else. To his surprise, Ethan told her things he hadn't told anyone, about his mother's death, his first heartbreak, how silence sometimes followed him like a ghost. And all the while, the city pulsed around them, alive and oblivious to the slow burn unraveling in that corner of the lounge. She laughed once, quietly, and he thought it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. He didn't ask for her number. He didn't offer his card. When the bar neared closing, he leaned in slightly, his breath close enough to send a tremor down her spine. "Come with me," he said softly. Amara blinked. "Where?" "My place." There was no smirk, no cocky glint. Just intensity, quiet, raw, almost desperate. Just one night. The words hung unspoken between them, and for reasons she couldn't explain, Amara nodded. As they stepped into the elevator together, two strangers bound by something more profound than attraction, neither knew this wasn't just a night. It was the beginning of everything. Love stories aren't always soft. Sometimes they're intense. They're obsessive, unforgettable. If this chapter stirred something in you, let your thoughts bloom in the comments below. What do you think brought Amara to the bar that night? Like if you felt the tension spark. Follow the channel, because this story is only just beginning. The elevator ascended with a slow hush, cocooning them in silence as the city's chaos fell away floor by floor. Ethan stood beside her, his tall frame radiating heat in the confined space. His hand never touched hers, but Amara could feel his electric nearness, the weight of his presence, like standing too close to fire and knowing it might burn you, but not caring. She kept her eyes on the small glowing numbers above the door, trying not to notice how her heart was pounding. It had been so long since she'd felt anything like this irrational pull, this gravity towards someone she barely knew. And yet, he didn't feel like a stranger. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the top floor. Ethan stepped out first, then turned slightly, waiting for her. She followed, her heels soundless against the marble as they entered a private penthouse that whispered wealth not through extravagance, but through silence and space. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in the soft glow of Manhattan's skyline. Everything was sleek, modern, and masculine, glass, stone, and restraint. It was a place built for power, but beneath the polish, it felt lonely. Ethan loosened his tie as he walked toward the kitchen, opened a cabinet, and retrieved 2 glasses. Wine? She hesitated. Sure. He poured without asking what kind, and she noticed that again. He made decisions the way most people breathed, effortlessly, unapologetically. She took the glass he offered, their fingers brushing. Silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt intimate. Amara sipped slowly, letting the warmth unfurl inside her. "This doesn't feel like you do this often," he said, breaking the quiet with that low, controlled voice. She looked at him. "Go home with a stranger?" His lips lifted into something between a smirk and a sigh. "Yes." "I don't," she said. He didn't press. He didn't joke. Instead, he studied her in that intense, focused way of his, like she was a puzzle he wasn't trying to solve, understand. "Why tonight?" he asked. Amara glanced away, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "I needed to feel like someone else, just for a few hours, someone who wasn't tired, or behind on rent, or wondering if she'll have to pick up a 3rd job." She wasn't sure why she said it, or gave away pieces of herself so easily to this man. Maybe because he looked like someone who'd never had to worry about a thing. Maybe because some of her wanted him to see the cracks and not turn away. Ethan's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. "I shouldn't have said that," she murmured. "It's not your problem." He stepped closer, his voice lower now. I don't think less of you. Amara blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. I think most people are just trying to stay above water, he continued. Some are better at pretending they're not drowning. She met his gaze again, and something shifted between them. A mutual, quiet acknowledgement of the messiness of life. A thread of understanding, however fragile, had been woven. Ethan set his glass down. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped closer until he stood just before her. He didn't reach for her. He didn't say anything. He just waited. And somehow, that was what unraveled her. She leaned up, barely, letting her lips brush against his. It was feather-light, hesitant, until it wasn't, until his hand found her waist, drawing her closer, his mouth claiming hers with a hunger that shocked them both. There was no polite buildup, no careful seduction, just fire. The raw kind that scorches and consumes and makes you forget your name. Amara's glass fell to the carpet with a soft thud. Forgotten. She didn't remember how they reached the bedroom. Only the sound of his breath at her ear, the heat of his hands sliding under the thin straps of her dress, the low growl in his throat when she trembled under his touch. And then, she stiffened. He pulled back instantly. What is it? He asked, voice husky but cautious. Her cheeks burned, but she held his gaze. Realization flickered in his eyes. Sharp, fast. You're a virgin? She nodded once, her body rigid, her heart thudding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She braced for the reaction she'd gotten before, the discomfort, the shift, the excuses. But Ethan didn't move away. Instead, something in his expression changed. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkened, not with lust, with something else, something fierce, protective. You should have told me, he said softly. I thought it didn't matter, she whispered. It matters more than you know. His hand came up, cupping her face with surprising gentleness. You're sure? He asked. And in his voice, there was no demand, no pressure, care. She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt seen for the first time in a long time. Felt safe. I'm sure, she breathed. He kissed her again, slower this time. And when he touched her, it was reverent, patient, as if he knew he was about to change something inside her that couldn't be undone. That night, he didn't just take her virginity, he took her breath, her doubts, the last walls she had left. And when it was over, and she lay curled against him, Ethan whispered into her hair, You're not just a one-night thing. She didn't respond, couldn't. But something in her chest cracked open, and from that moment on, everything changed. Morning came with a hush, not the bright kind that burst through windows with noise and certainty, but the soft kind that slipped in like a secret, barefoot, golden, and slow. The Manhattan skyline outside Ethan's penthouse glowed under the first blush of sunlight, a warm hue filtering through floor-to-ceiling glass like spilled honey. Inside, the room remained still, the kind of stillness that only exists between two people wrapped in something they don't yet have words for. Amara stirred first. Her eyes blinked open to the unfamiliar ceiling above her, the weight of the night before still lingering on her skin, in her bones, in the space between memory and disbelief. For a moment, she didn't move, just breathed. The silk sheets felt too soft beneath her. The warmth curled around her too comfortably, and the steady rise and fall of the chest beneath her cheek reminded her this wasn't a dream. Ethan was still there. He was lying on his back, one arm cradling her against him, his other hand resting on his stomach. Even in sleep, his body exuded quiet authority. His jaw was relaxed, his lashes long against the high angles of his cheekbones, and his lips, those lips that had stolen her breath last night, were parted slightly, as if he was dreaming something just out of reach. She studied his face in the silence. He looked peaceful. It startled her. The Ethan she'd met at the bar had been controlled, deliberate, magnetic in that terrific, dangerous way. But this version, the one sleeping beside her now, was different. He looked younger, less guarded, human. And somehow, that made it harder to breathe. Amara shifted slightly, careful not to wake him, though his arm instinctively tightened around her waist, anchoring her to him as if he feared she might vanish. Maybe he wasn't so far from dreaming after all. She lay her head back against his chest, letting the rhythmic beat of his heart calm her. But inside, a quiet storm was brewing. Because this, whatever this was, wasn't supposed to happen. She'd walked into that bar to escape, to forget. One night, she had promised herself. Just one reckless night where she didn't have to worry about bills, her second job at the diner, or the rejection email she hadn't even opened from the graduate program she'd dared to apply to. But Ethan had undone her carefully constructed plan with nothing but a glance. And last night had unraveled her. She wasn't naive. She knew what usually followed nights like this. A cab ride home, a polite but distant goodbye, a name that fades like mist by morning. But Ethan had said things that didn't sound like goodbye. You're not just a one-night thing. She closed her eyes, willing herself not to read into it. Words were easy in the dark, easier still when spoken between tangled sheets and burning skin. She'd be foolish to think a man like Ethan Callahan, a billionaire, a corporate god, a man who could have anyone, would want something more with someone like her. She was no one, a girl from the Bronx who spent more time worrying about rent than romance, a woman who'd learned how to keep her walls high and her voice quiet. She didn't belong in this world of crystal glasses and penthouse views. Still, the way he'd touched her, no one had ever touched her like that. Like she wasn't just wanted, but treasured. She sighed, sitting up slowly, clutching the sheet to her chest as she slid out of bed. Her dress lay crumpled on the armchair, her heels kicked off somewhere near the door. She padded across the cold marble floor and found her phone on the nightstand, the screen glowing with several unread messages from her roommate, her sister, and one from her boss at the bookstore reminding her of her afternoon shift. Reality. She bit her lip, fighting to gather her things and leave quietly, to vanish before she did something foolish, like hope. But before she could move, a voice rumbled from behind her. "You weren't going to leave without saying goodbye, were you?" She froze. Ethan's voice was thick with sleep, still low and scratchy in a way that made her stomach flutter. She turned slowly, sheet still wrapped tightly around her. "I didn't want to wake you." His eyes, still heavy-lidded, held hers as he sat up against the headboard, the blanket slipping low on his waist. "You already did." Amara hesitated, then crossed her arms, more from self-preservation than modesty. "I should go. I have work." He studied her for a long moment, then reached for the glass of water on the nightstand. "Do you want to go or think you should?" She blinked. "Is there a difference?" His smile was slow, knowing, a huge one. She didn't reply. Ethan set the glass down and motioned for her to return to the bed. "Stay for a little while. We don't have to talk. Lie with me." She wanted to say no. She wanted to keep her distance, to protect whatever part of her had survived the night without surrendering entirely. But her body betrayed her. She strolled toward him, the morning light painting her skin in hues of honey and bronze. He pulled the blanket back slightly, welcoming her in without a word. And when she settled against him, her cheek on his chest once more, he breathed like he'd been holding it all night. They stayed like that for a while, silent, breathing in sync. She could feel the questions rising between them, unspoken and restless. What now? What does this mean? Is it still just one night if neither of them wants to let go? But neither asked. Instead, Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers threading through hers with surprising tenderness. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, as if memorizing it, branding it into his mind. "You don't have to be anyone else with me, Amara," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond, not because she didn't believe him, but because something about that sentence shattered a piece of her she hadn't even known was still intact. So she closed her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to exist. With him. The sun was higher when Amara finally slipped out of Ethan's penthouse. She left quietly, though not without a backward glance. Just one, standing in the foyer with her heels in her hand, the morning silence clinging to her skin like silk. He was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. She hadn't kissed him goodbye. She hadn't known how. Outside, the world had moved on, as if nothing had changed. The streets buzzed with people chasing something. Appointments, success, maybe love if they were lucky. Amara blended in like a shadow, her coat pulled tight around her body, trying to hold in the confusion, warmth, and ache that had settled deep in her chest. She didn't know what to call it. It wasn't regret. It wasn't reasonably fair either, but it clung to her ribs, silent and persistent. The cab ride back to her apartment in Harlem was a blur. When she stepped into her building, a walk-up with creaking stairs and chipped paint, reality hit her in the face like cold air after warmth. The hallway smelled faintly of burnt toast and old wood. Her mailbox overflowed with envelopes, most of them bills. The contrast between this place and Ethan's penthouse made her dizzy. She paused before her door, staring at the tarnished brass numbers like they no longer belonged to her. Maybe, for a moment last night, they hadn't. Her tiny apartment was as she'd left it, cluttered but cozy, full of books stacked in uneven towers and the lingering scent of lavender oil. She dropped her purse onto the couch and stood in the living room, letting the silence settle. And then, doubt crept in like a ghost she'd forgotten to invite. What had she done? What had she started? Ethan awoke to the quiet hum of city traffic far below and the lingering scent of her on his pillow. Amara. He rolled over, reaching for her without thinking, but all he found was emptiness. Cool sheets. A faint indentation where her body had been. She was gone. He stared at the ceiling, jaw tightening. It shouldn't have surprised him. He wasn't the kind of man women stayed for. They came for the thrill, the danger, the brief privilege of being close to power. And then they left, either by his hand or theirs. But last night had been different. She had been different. And it wasn't just the fact that she'd been a virgin. It was how she'd looked at him like he wasn't just a name or a number. The way she'd touched him with hesitation, not calculation. As if she were afraid to be seen, not eager to be remembered. That vulnerability had stayed with him, lodged under his skin like a splinter he couldn't remove. He got up and moved through the penthouse with the silent precision of a man accustomed to solitude. But the silence irritated him today. It made her absence too loud. He showered, dressed, and tried to focus on the schedule his assistant had sent over. Calls, meetings, and a board presentation. but none registered. He kept thinking about her. She'd fallen asleep with her hand curled over his chest, as if trying to hold something in place. By noon, he'd made a decision. He opened his phone, scrolled to his contacts, then stopped. He didn't have her number. His lips twitched, half amusement, half frustration. She had walked into his life, taken up space in his bed, in his breath, and vanished without leaving so much as a trace. But Ethan Callahan had built an empire from nothing. He didn't take kindly to what he couldn't control. He buzzed his assistant. "I need you to find someone who..." Yata. Across town, Amara sat curled up on her couch, staring at her phone. She hadn't expected a message from him, or even expected to want one. But every time it buzzed, a strange flicker of hope sparked through her. And she told herself she was relieved every time it wasn't him. It wasn't true. She didn't want to admit how much she remembered. The way his breath had caught when she'd said she was sure. The way his arms had wrapped around her after, not possessively, but protectively, like she was something rare, something that mattered. But she wasn't rare. She was a woman barely keeping herself afloat. A woman who worked 2 jobs and still counted every dollar. A woman who had long since learned that men like Ethan didn't stay. Not for someone like her. She'd made a choice, she reminded herself. She'd left. She hadn't said goodbye because she didn't trust herself to say it without asking for more. And more was dangerous. She couldn't afford to want things she couldn't keep. Still, her breath caught when her phone finally buzzed with a name she hadn't saved, but couldn't forget. "Ethan, you didn't call." The words were simple, plain, but they carried weight. Amara stared at the screen, her fingers trembling. She started typing, erased it, then typed again. "Amara, I didn't think you wanted me to." His reply came fast. Too fast. "Ethan, I told you I need more nights with you." She closed her eyes. That wasn't just a line. He meant it. She could feel it in the urgency of his response. But what would more mean? More control? More confusion? More ways to lose herself? She typed again. "Amara, I don't know if this is a good idea." The pause that followed felt like a lifetime. And then her phone rang. She didn't answer at first. Just stared at the screen as his name flashed again and again. Finally, she pressed it to her ear. "Lena." His voice was low, steady, but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "You found my number. I find what I want." Her chest tightened. "You don't even know me. I know how you make me feel." Amara hesitated. "That's not enough." He exhaled. "Then let me change that." She swallowed hard. "Where are you?" he asked. She glanced around her apartment, the cracked paint, the tiny kitchen, the stack of unopened bills. "I just got home." "Good. Stay there." The call ended. Amara stared at the phone, her heart pounding. She didn't know what he meant, didn't know what she was waiting for. But something told her. He was already on his way. And for better or worse, everything was about to shift again. The knock came sooner than she expected. A low, measured knock, not frantic, not impatient, just inevitable. The kind of knock that didn't ask permission. The kind that said, "I'm already here, and I'm not leaving." Amara froze in the middle of her apartment, heart tight in her chest. She hadn't changed out of her worn, oversized tee, brushed out her curls, or tidied the clutter of papers on her kitchen table. She hadn't prepared for anything. That may be the point. She walked to the door slowly, fingers curling around the handle. She stood there momentarily, her breath catching in her throat. She could turn back, pretend she wasn't home, pretend last night had been a fever dream, Pretend he wasn't already beneath her skin. Instead, she opened the door. And there he was. Ethan Callahan stood in the dim hallway, as if he didn't belong there. His sharp suit was charcoal gray today, tailored with the kind of precision that whispered obscene wealth, but his eyes were fixed on her with a heat that stripped away the veneer of power. "You came," she said softly. "I told you I would." He didn't step forward, not yet. Just watched her, carefully, like she was something breakable, something beautiful and fragile. He didn't know how to touch without ruining it. Amara stepped aside. Ethan entered the small apartment with a quiet intensity, and for a moment, he took it in. The worn couch with its faded throw pillows, the bookshelves that bowed under the weight of used paperbacks, the chipped ceramic mug holding pens that had run dry. He said nothing, but she felt the weight of his silence. "This is where you live," he said finally. She nodded. His jaw tensed. "You said you worked 2 jobs." She shrugged. "It's what I need to do." He turned to her then, eyes darker than she remembered. "You didn't have to walk out this morning." "I did." Her voice was gentle but steady. "Because this, whatever this is, it's not real. It's real for me." She faltered. Ethan stepped closer, closing the distance slowly. His hand lifted, brushing a curl from her face, fingertips lingering on her cheekbone. "You think this is about control," he murmured. "About power. But it's not. Isn't it?" she whispered. He didn't answer, because it was, maybe, in some corner of him. He hadn't examined it yet. But it had always been about possession. She had given him something no one else ever had, something tender, unclaimed, unrepeatable. But it had become more than that. She wasn't just the girl who'd slept in his bed. She was the thought he couldn't silence, the calm he hadn't realized he'd been chasing his entire life. Amara stepped back before she could fall into him. "I don't belong in your world, Ethan. You belong with me," he said quietly. "That's not the same thing." A silence settled between them, thick and loaded. He looked around again, and something in his expression shifted. "What do you owe?" he asked, voice low. She blinked. "What?" "For rent. For everything. Tell me." "No." "Why?" "Because I'm not a project. I'm not a girl you rescue to feel good about yourself." His eyes flared, a flash of something close to anger rising before he tamed it. "I never said you were. But that's how this feels." He stepped closer again. "Then tell me how it's supposed to feel." Amara looked up at him, her voice unsteady. "Like we're equals. Like I'm not something you can fix with money, gifts, or promises you haven't thought through." Ethan exhaled slowly. He was used to being in control of meetings, mergers, and people who bowed to his name without question. But this woman, she didn't bend, not even when she trembled. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said finally. "I tried to. I went back to work, took the meetings, smiled for the press, but I kept returning to how you looked at me like I wasn't made of stone, to the way you touched me like I was real." Her breath hitched. "And I realized," he continued, "that I didn't just want another night with you. I wanted to know what you look like when you laugh in the morning. I wanted to know what your favorite song is when you're cleaning. I wanted, God, I wanted all of it. You, in your world, or mine. Anywhere." Amara didn't speak. Couldn't, because the way he said it, raw, without polish, stripped of pretense, made her believe he meant every word. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I'm not gentle. I'm not patient. But I'll learn, if that's what it takes. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. And if I say I'm scared, I'll be scared with you. A long silence fell between them. Then slowly, she reached for his hand. He didn't grip it, just held it, open, steady, waiting. And for the first time since last night, something in her eased. You don't get to buy your way in, she said quietly. I know. You don't get to demand either. I don't want to. You're impossible. His lips lifted, just barely. I've heard. She exhaled, a breath that felt like release, like surrender, like hope, blooming quietly in the corner of a life that hadn't made space for it in a long time. Stay, she said. Ethan nodded once. He didn't leave that night, and neither did she. The rain came without warning. It swept across the city in a slow, relentless hush, turning sidewalks slick, painting reflections into the pavement like oil on glass. Inside Amara's apartment, the windows fogged gently from the contrast in temperature, the warmth of the room, and the chill beyond the glass, creating a soft blur between worlds. Ethan stood by the window, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled to his elbows, watching the storm as if it had something to say to him. The way he stood, still and contained, made him look more like a portrait than a man. Timeless, untouchable. Amara watched from across the room, barefoot in an old sweatshirt and leggings, cradling a chipped mug of tea that had long gone cold. She hadn't said much since he arrived. She hadn't needed to. The silence between them was not emptiness. It was presence. He turned, finally, catching her watching him. I don't like the idea of you living here, he said quietly. Amara arched a brow. You've been here less than 20 minutes. I've seen enough. She gave a small, cautious smile. It's not much, but it's mine. And mine's better, he replied evenly. The air shifted. He didn't mean it cruelly, but his words, so matter-of-fact, so unflinching, brushed against a raw place in her chest. She set her mug down, careful to keep her voice even. Better how? He stepped away from the window, folding his arms. It's safer. Bigger. You'd have space. Privacy. Real locks on the doors. A building with security. And no memories, she murmured. Ethan tilted his head. Memories? This place. She glanced around. It's the first thing I paid for on my own after I left home. After I stopped waiting for someone to save me. Every scuff mark and cracked tile is something I survived. I know it's small, and I know it's worn, but it holds pieces of me. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze unreadable. I didn't mean to insult it, he said. I know, but I still don't like it. She exhaled. Because it's not yours. His jaw tightened. You're used to things being within reach, she continued, to make a call and have the world rearrange itself. But I'm not a corner office or a stock acquisition. You can't move me around like a decimal point. I'm not trying to move you, he said, voice taut. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From struggling. She stepped toward him slowly, her arms folded across her chest. You can't remove the parts of me that struggle, Ethan. That's how I was made. And maybe I don't want to be protected from that. Maybe I want to be seen in it. Something flickered in his eyes then, a fracture in the stone. I do see you, he said quietly. She didn't answer. He crossed the room, stopping just in front of her. I see the way you hide when someone compliments you. The way you downplay your brilliance is like it's something shameful. I see the circles under your eyes from working late and the tension in your shoulders when you lie about being fine. I see you, Amara, and it terrifies me." That last sentence hung in the air like a dropped glass, sharp and delicate all at once. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because I've never wanted anything I couldn't control." Her breath caught. Ethan reached up, brushing a knuckle along her jawline. "But I don't want to control you. I want to keep you. There's a difference." She leaned into his touch despite herself. "Is there?" "Yes," he murmured. "Control makes you something I own. Keeping you means learning how to deserve you." The silence that followed was heavy, but not burdensome. It felt like the space after a confession, where breath returns and honesty settles in. She laid her hand on his chest, feeling the rhythm of his heart beneath her palm. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know, and I don't want to lose myself." "You won't," he said, "because I won't let you." She looked up at him then, and what she saw in his expression wasn't just desire. It was reverence. A man who'd stood at the top of every tower suddenly realized that none mattered if he couldn't share the view. He pulled her into his arms, and she went without resistance this time. His hold wasn't crushing. It was steady, sure, like he knew precisely how tightly to hold without breaking her. Later, they sat on the couch, the sound of rain filling the silence between them. She was wrapped in a throw blanket, legs tucked under her, while Ethan scrolled through emails on his phone, business never quite letting go. She watched him in the dim light. "I can't promise to be someone I'm not," she said softly. Ethan looked up. "I don't want you to be, and I can't promise I won't push back, or pull away, or question everything. You wouldn't be you if you didn't." She gave him a look, half amused, half moved. "And you? I can't promise I won't be intense, or that I won't sometimes try to fix things that aren't mine to fix. At least you're honest." "I can promise one thing," he said, reaching for her hand. "If you let me in, I'll never walk away." Amara held his gaze. There it was again, that dangerous, tender truth that crept into every corner of their story. He wasn't offering perfection. He wasn't asking for blind trust. He was offering presence and persistence. And somehow, despite the fear, the difference in their worlds, and everything that should have made this impossible, she believed him. She laid her head on his shoulder, her hand still in his, and let herself rest. Not because everything was figured out, but because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't carrying it all alone. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the world outside felt changed, washed clean, as if overnight the sky had sighed something away. The streets shimmered, the gutters hummed, and the light filtering through Amara's window had that particular stillness only found after a storm. Amara sat barefoot in an old robe at her tiny kitchen table, a half-eaten slice of toast growing cold on her plate. She watched Ethan across the room, where he stood at the sink rinsing out 2 mugs like he did every morning. Like this wasn't the penthouse prince lost in a Harlem shoebox. Like he wasn't wearing a shirt that didn't belong to him, hers, oversized and slightly faded. The words, "Harlem Bookshop Crew," peeling across the front. He looked oddly domestic, strangely at peace, and that unsettled her more than anything. She couldn't take her eyes off him. Not just because of how he looked, though God, that was reason enough, but because of how quietly he had embedded himself into this space, into her life, into places she hadn't thought to guard. "I don't even know what you like for breakfast," she said softly. He glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I like whatever's on your table." "That's not an answer." "Then how about this?" he said, setting the mugs down and walking toward her. "I like mornings that begin with you." She looked away, trying to mask the way her breath hitched. "That's not sustainable," she murmured. He reached her, leaned one hand on her chair, the other brushing her cheek. "Neither is pretending this doesn't matter." Her heart skipped, not because of the words, but because of how he said them, low, unhurried, as though truth didn't need volume to be heard. Amara stood and moved to the window, needing air and space. "What happens now, Ethan? You keep coming back here, pretending this could fit into your life?" "I'm not pretending. You're a billionaire, remember?" She turned, arms crossed. "You have meetings in Dubai, dinners with senators, boardrooms and bodyguards and press cameras that catch everything you breathe. You don't have space for this. For me. I'll make space." She laughed then, not cruelly, just quietly broken. "It's not just about space. It's about place. I don't fit in your world. You fit in mine more than anyone ever has. Because I'm different? Because you're real." There was silence after that. A long, heavy silence hung in the room like fog. Then Amara spoke, her voice softer. "Do you know what people will say?" He nodded once. "Yes. They'll think I'm using you. They already think worse about me." She blinked, caught off guard by the ease in his voice. "Doesn't that bother you?" Ethan stepped forward again, slowly, deliberately. "It used to, but not anymore. Not if the cost of caring is losing something I want." "And what is it that you want?" "You. Just you." There was a finality in the way he said it. No flourish, no grand declarations, just a fact, settled and certain, as if it had always been true. Amara looked down at her hands. Her fingers still bore the faint ink smudges from last night's sketching, an old habit she picked up when her mind got too loud. She'd been working on a charcoal drawing, something raw, half-formed, a woman standing at a crossroads, her back turned to the viewer, hands unclenched, the wind pulling at her hair like a question. Maybe that woman was her. Maybe she'd always been waiting at a threshold, not knowing which door to choose. She turned to Ethan again, seeing him, not the tycoon, money, headlines, but the man. And he wasn't just standing in her apartment. He offered her a space inside his life that no one else had ever dared to invite her into. And that, more than all the rest, terrified her. "I don't know how to do this," she said. He stepped closer again, so close now she could feel his heat. "We'll figure it out," he whispered. "Together." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because in the next moment, she closed the distance between them. Not in some sweeping, romantic gesture, but in a quiet lean, a surrender of doubt, a slow collapse into the truth. She was too tired to keep resisting. Her forehead rested against his chest. His hand found the small of her back, and they stood there like that, in the middle of a tiny kitchen, in a neighborhood the world would overlook, breathing the same air, dreaming something they hadn't dared say aloud yet. Later, she took him by the hand and pulled him toward the bedroom. Not out of lust, but need. To be close, to be held, to be still. No words passed between them as they lay down. Her back against his chest, his fingers brushing slowly into her hip, anchoring her. The light shifted as afternoon began to settle in. Outside, the clouds moved lazily, casting slow-moving shadows across the walls. Inside, the question still lingered in the air. Could they belong in the same story? Amara didn't know. But as Ethan pulled the blanket over them and whispered her name into the hollow behind her ear, she allowed herself, just for that moment, to believe the answer might one day be yes. The next few days passed like pages caught in a quiet breeze. Slow, unfolding, tinged with an ache so delicate, it was almost beautiful. No grand declarations or promises were spoken into the ceiling at midnight. Just glances. Just presence. Just the stillness of two people figuring out how to breathe in the same room without collapsing under the weight of what wasn't said. Ethan stayed longer than he meant to. At first, it was a few hours after dawn. Then it became mornings that bled into afternoons. Then evenings, tangled legs under thin sheets, and whispered conversations that hovered between memories and maybes. He worked from her apartment when he could, tapping into conference calls with his AirPods, while Amara scribbled in her sketchbook at the kitchen table. It was a strange intimacy that wasn't loud or desperate, but quiet in the way real things are. And yet, the more he stayed, the more she noticed the edges. He moved through her space like a man trying to disappear into it, but his presence was impossible to erase. The contrast between them was stark in the most minor things. The watch on his wrist alone could pay her rent for a year. The way he read news headlines from an iPad she didn't know how to navigate. How he answered emails without looking up, always speaking in clipped, precise tones, like the world waited on his breath. He never made her feel small, but the gap was there, invisible, inescapable. She felt it most when he left his cufflinks on her nightstand, polished silver against chipped wood, or when his driver called and addressed her as ma'am, like she was suddenly part of a language she didn't speak, or when his phone rang at odd hours and he silenced it without looking, his jaw tight in that quiet way that said he didn't want to lie, but didn't know how to tell the truth. One night, Amara sat by the window, legs tucked beneath her, a blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. Ethan was on the phone in the next room, voice low and tense, pacing her hallway with the kind of restraint she'd only seen in men used to breaking things they couldn't fix. She didn't listen. Not exactly. But she heard enough. Names she didn't recognize. Numbers. Deadlines. Something about shareholders and an acquisition window closing. Then something that made her still completely. No, she doesn't know. And I'm not ready to tell her. Her chest went hollow. When he ended the call, he stepped back into the living room, the tension still clinging to his skin like smoke. She didn't turn around, just stared out the window, watching the amber city lights flicker through a veil of fog. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice calm. He didn't answer right away. "Just work." She nodded. "You're good at compartmentalizing." He frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means you know how to live a double life." He moved closer. "Amara, don't." She turned, and the look in her eyes stopped him in his tracks. "I'm not asking for a title. I'm not asking for you to explain every boardroom decision. But don't lie to me, not by omission." His expression softened. "I wasn't lying. You said you weren't ready to tell me. That's not the same as being honest." The silence between them turned sharp. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted in a low voice. "I've never had to share this part of myself with someone." "I'm not someone," she said gently. "I'm the woman you wake up next to. The woman who's let you into her quietest spaces. You don't get to take all of me and offer back only what's convenient." He looked at her then, not as the woman who challenged him, not as a beautiful body in his bed, but as a mirror. One that reflected not just who he wanted to be, but who he hadn't yet become. "You're right," he said after a pause. "There's something I need to tell you." She waited. "I'm being pressured to enter a different kind of spotlight," he said carefully. "Politics. They want me to run." She blinked. "For office?" "Senate. Eventually." "And you're considering it?" "I'm not saying yes. Yet. But you haven't said no." He nodded once, slowly. Amara stood, walking toward him, searching his face. "And what does that mean for me?" "That's the part I don't know how to navigate," he admitted. Because when they vet me, they'll vet you. Everything you've ever done, said, or posted will become a headline. They'll ask why I'm with you. They'll paint you into a narrative that has nothing to do with who you are. And will that matter to you? It'll matter, he said quietly, but not the way they think. It'll matter because I don't want you to get hurt. She looked away, swallowing hard. I've been hurt before, Ethan, but not like that. Not on a stage I didn't ask to be on. He stepped forward, taking her hands in his. Then let me protect you. That's not what I want from you. Then tell me what you want. I want to be chosen, she said. Not hidden, not explained away, not packaged into something palatable for donors or voters. I want to be loved out loud, or not at all. The silence after that was painful in its clarity. He didn't let go of her hands, but he didn't speak either. Because love for Ethan had always been quiet, negotiated, bound in the shadows of consequence. But Amara wasn't asking for shadows. She was asking to be seen. He knew then that something in him would have to shift, not for her, but because of her. Because the woman standing in front of him, barefoot, fierce, vulnerable, deserved more than stolen mornings and silenced phone calls. She deserved a future she didn't have to question. But whether he could give that to her was a question he wasn't ready to answer yet. Not tonight. So he held her hand just a little tighter, as if that alone could keep the truth at bay. And Amara, who had learned to read silence like scripture, felt the first real distance between their bodies. Not physical, but deep, quiet, and dangerously familiar. The first sign wasn't the silence. It was how Ethan began checking his phone with half a breath between touches, like waiting for something unspoken to arrive. It was the way his eyes drifted in the middle of their conversations, lingering somewhere far past the walls of Amara's apartment. It was the missed call from his chief of staff, and the text was left unread. And it was how she stopped asking. Amara had never been one to beg for space in someone's life. She had been raised knowing that people only hold the doors they want you to walk through. Lately, Ethan's doors have become confusing and have not closed, not open, just slightly ajar with no invitation. She started waking up before him, sitting by the window with tea that grew cold while the world outside stretched into color. She drew more in those days, sharp lines, restless shading, portraits with blurred mouths and closed eyes. She didn't show them to him. Ethan still kissed her shoulder every morning, still reached for her hand under the sheets, still looked at her like she was the only thing that softened him. But the weight of unspoken questions made even the gentlest touch feel temporary. One evening, they sat in the living room, each wrapped in quiet. A documentary murmured on the screen. He wasn't watching. She wasn't pretending to. Are you going? She asked suddenly. Ethan turned to her. Going? To D.C. The fundraiser. The one you said you were still deciding on. He hesitated. Yes. When? Tomorrow morning. Amara didn't respond right away. She stared at the screen where a lioness prowled the Serengeti, untamed and fierce. Then she turned back to him, calm but confident. And I'm not going with you. He didn't argue. He didn't say her name with that soft apology in his tone. Didn't reach for her hand or promise to call. He just nodded once, like it was already understood. And that, more than anything, made her heart pull tight. The next morning, she woke to find him already dressed, standing in the doorway with his suitcase. The sun filtered through the window, bathing the room in gold and dust. He looked like something out of reach. Sharp lines, tired eyes, collar perfectly in place. He crossed the room and brushed a kiss to her forehead. I'll be back Friday. Okay. He lingered. I didn't want to leave like this, he said. Then don't, she whispered. But he did. And the silence after the door clicked shut was not new to Amara. She had made a life from absences. She knew how to fill empty rooms. How can she converse with herself when no one else has stayed long enough to listen? Still, something about this absence felt different, because she hadn't imagined this one, and hadn't prepared herself to grieve what wasn't broken yet. She spent the day sketching him, not as a billionaire, not as the man with a 5-year plan and eyes that understood profit margins better than human warmth. She drew Ethan like she had seen him at 2 a.m., barefoot in her kitchen, stealing sips from her mug, hair messy from sleep. She pulled the curve of his jaw when he smiled at her mid-sentence, the stillness in his hands when they held her, like he feared he'd be too much. And then she drew a second version. Ethan, as the world saw him. In a suit, jaw locked, gaze distant, alone. She pinned both sketches side by side on her wall, stared at them for a long time. Then, quietly, I folded them away. By Thursday, she hadn't heard from him. No messages, no updates. Not even a late-night voice note like the ones he used to send when he couldn't sleep. She told herself he was busy. She said this was what dating a man like him looked like. Brief storms of intimacy, followed by weeks of drought. But no matter how much logic she poured over her aching chest, the emptiness settled there anyway. Heavy, constant. Friday evening came with rain again. Not the gentle kind, the angry kind. The type that swept the city into a hush. Traffic snarling, lights blurring in the downpour. Amara stood by her window, watching the streetlights bend through the water on the glass. And then she heard it. The elevator. A knock. 3 soft raps, just like before. She didn't run to the door. She strolled, unfolded. When she opened it, Ethan stood there, drenched and breathless, his umbrella abandoned somewhere behind him. His suit was soaked, the edges clinging to him in a way that made him look more human than ever. Their eyes met. Neither of them moved. I missed you, he said finally. But Amara didn't step aside this time. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, voice steady. Did you? His breath hitched. I thought about you the entire time, he murmured. But you didn't call. I couldn't. Or you wouldn't. A beat passed, then another, and finally, Ethan dropped his gaze. I was scared. Of me, of what you make me feel, of what this is turning into, of how much I don't want to lose it, and how much that terrifies me. Amara's voice softened. And what do you want now? He looked up, rain dripping from his hair, his eyes burning with something raw and unguarded. I want to stop hiding, he said. From them, from you, from myself. She studied him, the man she had let in, the man who had let her down. Then she opened the door a little wider, not because she had forgiven everything, but because some part of her still believed that the best things aren't perfect, they're possible, and that maybe, just maybe, love starts with choosing to open the door again, even after the rain. The door had opened, but the distance between them hadn't vanished. It merely shifted, less visible, more dangerous, like a current beneath calm water, silent and strong enough to drag them under. Ethan stayed that night, but everything felt quieter. Not the gentle quiet they had once shared, but the kind that came with restraint, with uncertainty. He kissed her like someone memorizing a goodbye. She held him like someone unsure of what part of herself was safe to offer. In the morning, he made coffee. She watched him from the bedroom doorway, arms folded, hair loose around her shoulders. The robe she wore was the same one she'd had for years, frayed at the sleeves, soft from use. It had never felt so unfamiliar on her skin. "Did they ask about me?" she asked softly. He didn't turn around. "Yes." "What did you say?" "That you're no one's business but mine." Her jaw tightened. "That's not the same as saying I matter." He set the coffee down slowly, finally turning to face her. "I didn't mean it like that. But that's how it sounds, Ethan." She took a step forward. "Like I'm a secret to be kept. Like I'm a liability you haven't figured out how to explain." He didn't deny it, didn't argue. And that silence was an answer in itself. She sat down at the table, staring at her hands. "You asked me to let you in." "I did. And now I feel like I'm the one standing outside." He sat across from her, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes shadowed. "I don't know how to be in both worlds simultaneously. You think I don't understand that?" Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. "I live in a world I wasn't built to belong in. Every time I walk into a room, I'm reminded of it. My body, skin, and voice all arrive before I do. But I still show up. I still dare to exist, create, and love, even when no one makes space for me." Ethan looked as if he'd been struck, his face unreadable. "I'm not asking you to fix the world, Ethan," she continued. "I'm asking you to decide if I have a place in yours." He ran a hand through his hair, the motion tired, the kind that came from carrying too many contradictions. "They warned me about this. About me. About what happens when someone like me falls for someone like you." The words landed sharply. "And what do they mean by someone like me?" Her voice was dangerously low. He exhaled. "Someone who can't be controlled, who challenges the narrative, who doesn't fit the polished image they think sells best." She laughed softly, bitterly. "So I'm a threat to your brand?" "No," he said quickly. "You're the only thing that ever made me question it." That caught her off guard. She searched his face to find the truth inside the tangle of politics and pressure. "Do you love me, Ethan?" His eyes flickered. "Yes." "Then prove it." He stood, walked over to her, and knelt. Something he'd never done before, not out of submission, but out of clarity. His hands rested on her knees, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll take you with me." Her brows drew together. "Where?" "To the next event. Public. Cameras. Black tie. All of it. I'll walk in with you. Let them see exactly who I love." Amara froze. It was what she had wanted. Not to be hidden, to be seen. But the promise came with a weight she hadn't expected. The world didn't just watch people like her. It dissected them, labeled them, and exploited their presence for a performance they never auditioned for. "Are you ready for that?" she asked quietly. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But I'm more afraid of losing you than facing them." For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Amara reached out and touched his face, tender but cautious. "If you do this, there's no turning back. Not just for you, for me too. Once I'm seen beside you, I'll be questioned, picked apart, measured against a world that was never meant to understand me. I'll stand with you through all of it." She looked away for a moment, gathering something invisible in the air. "I need to do this on my terms," she said. "Not as your accessory, not as your plus one. If I walk beside you, I need to know I'm not just a statement. You don't get to love me only when it's convenient." "I don't want convenience," he whispered. "I want you." Later that afternoon, she stood before her mirror, her phone in her hand, scrolling through designers she couldn't afford. Ethan sat on her bed, watching her with quiet curiosity. "You know," she said, not looking up. I'm not going to squeeze myself into their acceptable version. I'd be disappointed if you tried. She turned to him, lips quirking into a smile. Then you better be ready, Callahan, because they're not going to know what to do with me. He smiled. Real. Wide. The kind that softened every hard edge. Let them be confused. I'm not. That night, he returned to his penthouse for the first time in a week. She watched him go, her fingers brushing the edge of the doorframe like they could hold the moment together a second longer. She didn't ask him to stay. She didn't need to, because for the first time, he wasn't running from her. He was preparing the world to meet her, and that, more than any promise, was a beginning. The invitation arrived wrapped in ivory paper and sealed with gold, embossed with Ethan's initials and the name of a political gala that shimmered with the kind of weight Amara had never sought to carry. The type of night where power wasn't just worn, was measured by who held whose arm and whose smile was rehearsed down to the millimeter. The gala would be held at the Willoughby Grand, a glass and marble fortress in D.C., where cameras never blinked, and every word spoken beneath the chandeliers could echo into headlines. Amara stared at the invite for a long time. Then, slowly, she set it down, exhaled, and turned to the mirror. She would not change who she was to fit beside Ethan, but she would rise to meet him. She did not emerge timidly when she stepped out of the car that night. She unfolded, tall, poised, wrapped in midnight velvet that hugged her form like a question no one dared to ask. Her natural curls cascaded down her shoulders in soft defiance, and her earrings, bold gold cuffs, glimmered like armor. She wore no diamonds, no borrowed glamour, only herself. Ethan waited at the entrance, dressed in a classic black tuxedo, tailored to precision. But it was the way he looked at her. Not with hunger, not with pride, but with stillness that made everything else blur. In his eyes, she saw reverence, as if the world had shifted slightly, just to let her in. You're going to break every neck in that ballroom, he whispered, offering his arm. She accepted it, her hand slipping into the crook of his elbow. Let them stare. They entered, and stare they did. The air in the room changed with their arrival. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. Eyes shifted. Some widened. Some narrowed. Cameras pivoted as flashes began to spark like lightning behind thin smiles. 1,000 judgments disguised as curiosity. She held Ethan's arm tighter. A woman in pearls approached, lips pulled taut in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Callahan, she purred. You didn't say you were bringing a guest. Ethan didn't flinch. That was intentional. Amara offered a nod, her voice velvet smooth. I'm Amara Brooks. I believe you run a foundation for education equity? The woman blinked, thrown. Yes. I read your last report. Your budget allocations for Black and Latino students were interesting. A beat. I'd love to discuss your metrics sometime. The woman blinked again, smiled tighter, then excused herself with a nod that felt like retreat. Ethan turned to her, stunned. Amara raised an eyebrow. What? I read? He laughed, low and genuine, pride flickering behind it. As the evening wore on, Amara moved through the room like she belonged there, because she did. She spoke about community art programs, gentrification in Harlem, and what it meant to walk into spaces built without your voice and still hold your head high. Some people listened, others smiled politely and excused themselves. But no one forgot her. And Ethan? He never left her side. He didn't treat her like a trophy, didn't usher her into safety, didn't talk over her when questions got pointed. He let her stand. And when the conversations turned sharp, when old money smiles grew brittle, and someone asked, "So how did you two meet?" In a tone dipped in subtle accusation, Ethan leaned in and said, "I met her when I wasn't looking, and I've never seen anything clearer." Silence followed. Amara's fingers tightened ever so slightly on his arm. Later, as the orchestra swelled and couples drifted toward the marble floor, Ethan led her toward the edge of the ballroom. "Dance with me." She gave him a skeptical look. "You sure? This room doesn't seem built for people like me to waltz in the middle of it." It wasn't. "But we're here anyway." He held out his hand. She hesitated, then stepped into him. They moved slowly, deliberately, like time had softened around them. His hand found the small of her back, and her fingers rested gently on his shoulder. They didn't speak. The music filled the silence between heartbeats. Around them, the world continued its orbit. But inside that dance, inside that moment, it was just them. And Amara felt something shift, not in the room, but in her. She didn't feel like a guest anymore. She felt like a choice. When the music ended, Ethan didn't let go right away. "I meant what I said," he murmured, "about not hiding you." "I know," she whispered, "but this isn't about the cameras, or the donors, or the people who whisper behind their champagne glasses." "Then what is it about?" She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "It's about what happens when the music stops, when the lights are off and the world stops clapping. Will you still reach for my hand when no one's watching?" He answered without hesitation. Yes. And for the first time in a long time, Amara believed him. Because Ethan wasn't performing in the middle of a room built for performance. He was choosing. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt or defiance, but because something in her steadied something in him. And that, quietly, powerfully, was enough. The morning after the gala, Amara woke to an unfamiliar stillness. It wasn't the absence of noise. Traffic still hummed outside her window, and birds still argued with dawn. But something quieter, deeper. A hush that lived beneath her skin. The kind that follows a night where everything shifts, and you wake up not entirely sure who you are anymore. The sheets beside her were empty. Not cold, not abandoned, just briefly unoccupied. She rolled over, eyes still heavy, and found Ethan standing by the window in nothing but his slacks, coffee in hand, hair tousled from sleep, his gaze distant as the city below. She stayed still, watching him. There was a strange beauty in witnessing someone when they didn't know they were being seen. The way they stood, breathed, thought, the way the world moved behind their eyes. Ethan, in that moment, looked both powerful and unsure, as though he were standing at the edge of something that asked for surrender, and wasn't sure if he was ready. When he finally turned, he caught her eyes and smiled. Not the polished one he used at fundraisers or boardrooms. A slower, softer smile. One that lived in the corners. "You were incredible last night," he said. "I know." He chuckled, then crossed the room, sitting on the edge of the bed. "They won't forget you." That was never the point. What was? To remind them I didn't come to be palatable. He nodded. "You didn't just show up, Amara. You shifted the room." She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "But the room doesn't define us." "No," he agreed, squeezing gently. "It doesn't." They sat like that for a while. No rush. No curtain about to fall. Sunlight brushing against skin and silence folding around two people, learning to hold each other without armor. But peace, in Ethan's world, was always brief. By noon, his phone rang. Once, then again, then 5 times in a row. He finally answered. Callahan. Amara listened, not to the words, but the rhythm, the clipped tone, the silence between phrases. She knew that language now, the language of damage control. When he hung up, his expression had shifted, not cold, but distant. What happened? They want to run with it. With what? You. Us. He rubbed his jaw. Photos from last night. Headlines already drafted. Some flattering. Most not. She nodded slowly. And they want me to make a statement. She stood, pulling on her robe, voice even. What kind of statement? That I'm focusing on the campaign. That I'm not currently in a relationship. The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. Amara didn't flinch. Are you asking me to disappear? No. Are you asking me to wait quietly while you perform the version of yourself they approve of? I'm asking for time. She laughed, soft, bitter, not unkind. Time is a currency men like you spend like it's infinite. But I've lived enough of my life waiting for people to be ready. Ethan stood too. I'm not abandoning this. Then fight for it. Don't ask me to make myself small while you decide whether I'm worth the fallout. He stepped forward. You are. Then prove it. He reached for her face, thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. You think I don't want this? That I haven't been rearranging my life since the night I met you? I think you're still learning what kind of man you want to be. And I won't be collateral in the process. His hands dropped. The truth between them was tender and sharp. Later that day, Amara walked alone through the park near her apartment. It was the kind of day that made everything feel like a movie. Wind in her hair, leaves crunching beneath her boots, the scent of roasted peanuts from a street vendor. But inside, she was unraveling, not because of Ethan, but because of what she had given him, what she had let herself believe. How, for the first time in years, she'd cracked open a door that had long remained sealed. And now, she wasn't sure if she regretted it. She sat on a bench, breathed, and then pulled out her sketchbook. She drew him. Not how he looked at the gala, not how he stood in her bed or kissed her under chandeliers. She drew him as he was that morning, eyes conflicted, spine straight, hands caught between holding on and letting go. She shaded the background with buildings and headlines and 1,000 voices pulling him in directions she couldn't follow. And then, in the corner of the page, she drew herself, not watching, not chasing, just standing, whole, because that's what love had taught her, not to lose herself in someone else's story, but to write her own with courage, with truth, with grace. That night, Ethan didn't call, and she didn't wait, not because she didn't love him, but sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust that love doesn't always need to be chased. Sometimes it needs to be still, silent, and strong enough to let the other person find their way back to you, or not. It rained again the night Ethan came back. Not a violent storm, just a slow, steady rain that tapped on windows like memories and softened the city until everything felt a little too quiet. Amara stood by her kitchen sink. The lights dimmed low, steeping tea she didn't want. Her apartment smelled faintly of lavender and burnt toast, the way it always did when she was trying to distract herself with normalcy. She hadn't heard from him in 4 days, and still, some part of her had known he'd come. She heard the knock before it arrived. Just 3, slow, deliberate taps. She didn't rush to the door. She walked with the weight of everything that had been said and unsaid between them, of all the space stretched out like a scar across the days. When she opened it, Ethan stood there, not in a suit or armor, but in jeans and a worn navy sweater, hair damp, eyes tired. He looked like he hadn't slept. She didn't speak, neither did he. But something in the air shifted, a recognition, a quiet surrender, the invisible moment when someone drops the shield without asking if they'll be wounded for it. "I was wrong," Ethan said, voice hoarse. Amara didn't look away. "About what?" "Thinking I could have you without giving the world all of you." She tilted her head, a question waiting on her tongue. "I've spent my entire life managing perception, crafting an image, winning games no one else knew were being played." His breath trembled. "But I realized this week, I don't want to manage you. I want to stand beside you, even when it costs me." Amara crossed her arms, not from defense, but from the instinct to hold herself. "You said they wanted a statement. I gave them one. What kind? The kind that doesn't backpedal." He reached into his coat pocket and handed her his phone, already opened to a news page. She scanned the article, her pulse steady even as her breath caught. "Callahan speaks out. She's not a liability. She's my truth." He had said her name, publicly, with no apologies, no euphemisms, no diluted version of their story. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to come back with words," Ethan said. "I wanted to come back with action." For a moment, all she could do was look at him, the man who had once kept her in the shadows, not out of shame, but out of fear, and who now stood soaked in rain and consequence, finally unafraid. She stepped aside. He entered without a sound, his steps slow, measured. He moved through the space like he remembered it deeply, not as a guest, but as someone who had once known every drawer, every chipped mug, every corner where light liked to settle. They sat across from each other on the couch. Neither rushed. "I don't need a spotlight," Amara said softly. "I don't care about flashing lights or headlines or the opinions of people who never learned how to see someone like me without trying to reshape her." Ethan's eyes didn't waver. "I care about this," she continued, her fingers twitching lightly on her lap. "About coming home to someone who doesn't flinch when I'm angry, who listens when I'm quiet, who doesn't mistake independence for a lack of love. You never had to prove anything to me." "But I did, Ethan," she whispered. "Because every time you chose hesitation, I felt it. I felt the shrinking. And I swore long ago I'd never shrink for anyone again." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low. "Then don't. Grow louder. Take up more space. I want all of it." She let those words settle between them like rainwater on thirsty ground. Ethan stood and crossed the room. When he knelt in front of her, it wasn't grand. It wasn't rehearsed. Just a man stripped of all his power, kneeling because he needed her to see that he finally understood what it meant to show up. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes," he said, "but I promise I won't run from the hard parts. I'll stand beside you, even when the world doesn't applaud." Her hands found his face, and at that moment, there was no flash of passion, cinematic music, or dramatic kiss. Two people breathing in the same space again, letting themselves soften into each other, and letting forgiveness arrive quietly. Ethan didn't stay that night, not because he wasn't welcome, but because some bridges are built better when the wood dries slowly. Before he left, he paused at the door, glancing back. "Have dinner with me tomorrow?" Amara smiled, just enough to soften the ache. "Ask me again like you mean it." He did. And she said yes. Not to the dinner, to the rebuilding. It was the most minor things that changed first. Not grand declarations, not candlelit gestures meant to sweep her off her feet, but subtler moments, the kind that happened between sentences, between breaths, when the world wasn't watching. Ethan began showing up early, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to be there when Amara's day started. He made breakfast clumsily, burnt toast, uneven omelets, and always too strong coffee. She teased him for it, but somehow, the sight of him in her kitchen, barefoot and muttering to himself as he fumbled with the French press, became one of her favorite things. She started leaving her sketchbooks open, not intentionally. At first, it was habit, but soon, she stopped hiding the pages with his face in them. The ones that captured him not as a CEO, but as a man who laughed with his whole body, stared out windows too long, and sometimes looked at her like she was made of answers he didn't know how to ask for. He didn't speak when he saw them. He just looked at each page with reverence that made her heart ache. Their rhythm wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, conversations that slowed into silence when old habits threatened to rise again. Ethan still received calls at odd hours, still hesitated before answering questions about the future. Amara, too, had her walls, sharp in some corners, worn thin in others. But something had shifted. They no longer pulled away when the air thickened. They stayed. One Sunday morning, they drove to the Hudson Valley. It wasn't a planned trip. They had woken up with restless hearts and nowhere to be. And by noon, the car was packed with nothing but thermoses, sketch pads, and a playlist Ethan had made that was, unsurprisingly, awful. Amara laughed for most of the drive. He pretended not to care. They ended up on a trail overlooking a lake, the leaves turning copper and gold around them, the air crisp with October's first true breath. Amara sat on a rock with her knees pulled to her chest, sketching the water in quick strokes. Ethan lay back on the grass, eyes closed, one arm flung across his chest like he anchored himself to the sky. "You always look peaceful like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like you finally remembered how to exhale." He opened one eye. "You think I forget? I think you spent a long time only breathing when no one was looking." He turned his head to face her. "And now?" She paused, then smiled, just a little. "Now you're getting better at doing it in the daylight." They stayed like that until the sun sank low, their words growing sparse, replaced by the wind in the trees and the sound of leaves dancing across the dirt. There was no rush, no looming deadline, only the quiet closeness that didn't need to be named. Back at her apartment that night, Amara lit candles without thinking, not to set a mood, but to slow the evening down. Ethan was sprawled on her couch, glasses on, reading a book she had once said changed her life. He wasn't reading quickly. He was reading like he wanted to understand her better. She watched him for a long time, and something inside her softened further. This wasn't what she had expected. When she let him into her world, it had been like touching fire, thrilling, impossible, a little dangerous. She had expected either to be consumed by it or to walk away before it scarred her. But this was something else entirely. It was warmth, steady, quiet, earned. She joined him on the couch, curling beside him, her head on his chest. He didn't pause his reading, just shifted to make room for her, his fingers brushing her arm in that absent-minded way lovers touch when they've forgotten how not to. Eventually, he closed the book and let it fall to the floor. She tilted her head up. "What?" she asked. He stared down at her like the world had disappeared. "I keep thinking I've reached the edge of what I feel for you," he murmured. And then, something like today happens, and I realize I haven't even scratched the surface. She said nothing, because words would have been too small. Instead, She leaned up and kissed him. Not urgently, not to prove anything, just to let him know she had heard him, that his quiet truths meant more to her than all the polished declarations in the world. Later, as they lay in bed, the sheets tangled and the candles still flickering, Ethan traced slow circles on her bare back. "I want you to come to the retreat," he whispered. She blinked. "Retreat? With the board? In Maine? It's private, off record, but I want them to meet you. Not because you're some strategic move, but because you're part of my life now, and I'm done pretending otherwise." Amara didn't answer right away, but after a moment, she reached for his hand beneath the blanket and wove her fingers through his. "Okay," she whispered. And for the first time in months, she didn't brace herself for what might follow. Because there was something about this love that felt different now. It no longer asked her to bend. It waited, steady and sure, as she learned to bloom in its light. The retreat in Maine was nestled deep in the woods, where the trees grew tall and old, and the lake reflected the sky so clearly it felt like standing between two worlds. Amara had never been to this part of the country before, where wealth whispered instead of shouted, where power moved in quiet handshakes and slow glances over fire pits and wine. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun still warm, but the breeze holding the crisp edge of approaching winter. Ethan parked the car on the gravel path leading up to the main lodge. Behind them, the forest silence closed in like a soft embrace. Amara stepped out of the car in a long cream coat, her curls tucked into a knit scarf, eyes scanning the horizon. The lake stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by pine and birch. At that moment, the world felt vast, but not lonely. Ethan reached for her hand, not out of habit, but out of intention. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "It's beautiful here." "They'll try to be polite," he said, a quiet edge in his voice. "But this world, it's still learning how to welcome someone who changes its reflection." She turned to him. "I'm not here to be welcomed, Ethan. I'm here to be seen." He didn't smile. He just looked at her like she'd said something sacred. Inside, the lodge was filled with the scent of cedar and citrus, laughter rising from the hearth room where board members and their spouses had already gathered for drinks. Everything was designed to feel effortless. Cashmere sweaters, aged whiskey, gold watches passed off as afterthoughts. But Amara walked in like a woman carved from her silence. Not loud, not brash, just steady. She greeted people with grace, her voice smooth but precise, her gaze meeting theirs without apology. When someone asked what she did, she spoke about her community work. When they raised their brows at her art, she told them about the mural she was helping design for a women's shelter in Newark. She did not shrink. She didn't embellish. And slowly, the air around her began to shift, not out of admiration, but out of quiet recognition. Even the walls started to understand that this woman did not need their approval to belong. That night, at the dinner table set beneath a canopy of lanterns and stars, someone asked a question they'd all been circling. "How did you two meet?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "I walked into a room expecting to talk business, and she made me question every assumption I'd ever held." Amara didn't look away. She held his gaze and smiled. After dinner, they slipped away from the murmurs and brandy, walking along the path to the lake. The moon was low and full, silvering the water like a secret. Ethan removed his shoes, rolled up his pants, and stepped into the cold shallows. He turned, holding out a hand. "You're insane," she laughed. "Come on. You promised Maine wouldn't scare you." She raised an eyebrow, but stepped in after him anyway, the cold biting her skin, the wind wrapping around them. They stood ankle-deep in the lake, the silence folding around them like a blessing. "I used to think love was about arrival," she said softly. "Finding the one. getting the yes, crossing the finish line. And now? Now I think it's about what happens after the world gets quiet. When you're still choosing the same person in the small moments. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. I'm still choosing you. She leaned into him, her head against his chest, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of a man who had once built his life in numbers and now counted time by the softness of her breath. Later, back in the cabin, he fell asleep first. And Amara watched him, half in shadow, half in moonlight. His face had changed over the months. Softer, lighter, less guarded. There were still tension lines around his mouth, but they no longer spoke of arrogance. They talked of someone learning. She slipped out of bed, wrapping herself in one of his shirts, and walked to the window. Outside, the lake stretched endlessly into dark velvet. A loon called in the distance. The wind moved like a lullaby. Amara thought of the girl she used to be, afraid to be too much, too loud, too different. She thought of the nights she spent wondering if there was a place in the world where she could be entirely herself and still be loved. And then she looked back at the man sleeping in her bed, and she knew. Love, when real, doesn't knock. It walks in and makes a home. It learns your rhythms. It waits when you need space. It doesn't try to fix you. It sits with you in the dark and asks nothing more than your presence. And here, in this quiet room in the woods, Amara finally understood. She hadn't been chosen because she fit. She'd been selected because she didn't. Because her love didn't perform. It lived. And for the first time, she was not a guest in the story. She was the reason it was being told at all. Spring arrived in New York quietly that year. No dramatic bursts of color, no sudden perfume of cherry blossoms. Just the steady retreat of cold, the slow return of warmth, the sidewalks growing softer underfoot. It was the kind of change you only noticed if you'd stayed still long enough, if you had weathered the frost and waited, patiently, for the thaw. Amara sat by the studio window, her fingers smudged with charcoal. Outside, the city moved like it always did, urgent, relentless. But inside, time breathed differently. The sketch she'd been working on for weeks was finally done. It wasn't for a gallery, client, or the mural project in the Bronx. It was for her. It showed a man standing barefoot in a lake, eyes lifted to the stars, a woman watching from the shore, her gaze steady, her shadow stretching beside his in the water. Separate and together, not touching, but connected by something more profound than skin. She called it equally rooted. Behind her, Ethan padded into the room, barefoot, coffee in hand, reading glasses still perched low on his nose. He looked at the drawing and said nothing at first. Then, quietly, "Is that how you saw us?" Amara smiled. "Sometimes. And sometimes I saw us completely underwater." He chuckled and leaned down to kiss the top of her head. "Thank you for waiting, even when I didn't ask you to." "I didn't wait," she whispered. "I just stayed ready." There was something sacred in the life they had built. Not loud, not gilded, just quietly steady. Mornings that didn't require performances, nights that didn't ask for masks, disagreements that didn't escalate into battles, but softened into conversations. Apologies that were swift, forgiveness that was real, and love, not as performance, but as practice. Ethan had stepped away from his corporate throne 6 months ago, not because he had to, because he wanted to build something new with her. They launched a foundation together, not for publicity, not for legacy, but for the girl Amara used to be. The one who never saw herself in textbooks, who walked into galleries and never saw her skin in the paintings, who once thought love had to be earned by silence. The foundation focused on funding arts education for Black girls and rewriting narratives. on helping young women take up space and never apologize for it. And the best part? Ethan never tried to lead it. He supported. He listened. He stepped back when necessary. He learned to let her shine without casting his shadow across her light. They married in April. No tuxedos, no headline, just a rented cabin near the lake in Maine. She was in a cream silk dress that whispered rather than shouted. He had rolled up his sleeves, smiling like he knew something sacred had just begun. The ceremony lasted 8 minutes. They exchanged vows under a sky that had once held their silence. Afterward, they skipped stones across the water like children. And in that moment, Amara realized something. The greatest kind of love is not the one that consumes you. It's the one that sees you wholly and invites you to stay exactly as you are. Because being loved isn't the goal. Being understood and still chosen is. So if you're reading this now, wondering if that kind of love exists, if you've ever been told to shrink, to soften your edges, to make yourself easier to hold, remember this: you are not too much. Your voice is not too loud. Your roots do not grow in the wrong soil. There will be someone who shows up in the rain, who waits at your door without needing to be let in, who doesn't run when you speak your truth, who thanks you for it. And when that person comes, don't question it. Let them stay. Let them learn from you. Let them love you without asking you to rewrite your name to fit theirs. Because love, real love, doesn't just take. It expands. It listens. It becomes home. If this story stirred something in you, if you saw even a small reflection of yourself in Amara's quiet strength or Ethan's awakening, don't keep it to yourself. Please share it. Let it breathe. Leave a comment. Follow this space where we believe in love that doesn't ask us to change, but instead helps us return to who we were always meant to be. Until the next story finds you, may your heart remain soft, your voice remains bold, and your love remain real.